Estados Unidos no solo nos llegan sanciones y bloqueos, nos demuestra que desde los Estados Unidos, con ustedes presentes aquí en Cuba y con lo que hacen todos los días a favor de Cuba en los Estados Unidos, nos llega amistad, solidaridad, apoyo, esperanza y confianza.
Entre el 23 de abril y el 7 de mayo pasados, varios grupos de amigos procedentes de Estados Unidos visitaron Cuba para participar en las celebraciones por el 1 de mayo en nuestro país. Casi 300 amigos de Estados Unidos, representando a más de 50 organizaciones, se dieron cita en La Habana a través de diferentes proyectos que tienen relaciones históricas con organizaciones e instituciones de la isla. De sus experiencias junto al pueblo de Cuba y sus impresiones sobre el regreso a su país, estaremos comentando en nuestro programa de hoy. Como siempre le digo, quédese con nosotros, porque desde la sede del Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos ya le estamos dando la bienvenida y la invitación es a que comparta con nosotros esta nueva emisión. Como ya es conocido, Estados Unidos es el único país del mundo que exige licencia de viajes a sus nacionales para poder visitar Cuba. Sin embargo, a pesar de que estos proyectos viajaron de manera legal a nuestro país, a su regreso fueron acosados por sus autoridades aduanales y sobre ello nuestro equipo estuvo conversando con Leima Martínez Freire, directora de Norteamérica en el Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos, y Cheryl Lavache, copresidenta de la Red de Solidaridad con Cuba en Estados Unidos.
Desde el Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos, denunciar una vez más esa detención que se les realizó a varios de estos amigos en los aeropuertos al regresar a su país. Detención que incluyó retenerlos por varias horas, retenerles sus pertenencias, sus celulares y otros dispositivos digitales. Y hacemos la denuncia porque consideramos que estos amigos han venido a Cuba expresando su solidaridad, porque han venido a Cuba para demostrar que es posible un diálogo entre los pueblos y también es posible y debemos seguir trabajando para que haya un diálogo respetuoso entre nuestros gobiernos.
United States to join with the May Day celebration here in Cuba face difficulties going back. There's going to be more in this program about that, but what I want to talk about is the moment that these difficulties are taking place. The United States in 1960 wrote in the Mallory-Rubottom memo that the task for the United States was to, as inconspicuously as possible, create hardships for the Cuban people. In the new internet age, there are many ways for the United States to figure out and target the ways that Cuba has been able to survive under the blockade more than 60 years. The current way that is the focus is on travel and tourism. People in the United States have had to fight for their right to travel around the world, but especially to Cuba. When I first went to Cuba in 1985, travel to Cuba was illegal. Then spending money in Cuba, US money in Cuba, was illegal. And now we have to have a license. Dogs have licenses. People shouldn't have licenses. There is a specific general license to come to Cuba, has 12 categories, and in order to rent an Airbnb in Cuba, the United States government requires that you declare a category of travel. To buy an airline ticket to Cuba from the United States, not only US citizens, anyone traveling from a US airport must declare and sign a document saying what category they're traveling under. Cuba is the only country in the world where this is imposed. It is a unique US way of trying to prevent people coming to Cuba to see Cuba for itself. No one is saying that, you know, believe me, come to Cuba and see Cuba for yourself. So these are some of the historic moments that have led up to where we are. The most important thing is for people not to be deterred. We have traveled completely legally. We bring medical supplies. We bring other material aid, support for the Cuban people. We travel under support for the Cuban people. And we comply with the law. Nonetheless, our brigadistas and others, there were 156 people from the International People's Assembly who came, mostly young people, mostly people of color. We had close to 60 people from the National Network on Cuba. There were other member organizations of the National Network on Cuba. For example, Los Angeles U.S. Hands Off Cuba was one of them. Who were met at the airport by political questions and other asking for information that's not required by law. We feel that this is totally unjust, uncalled for, and it's an attack on us as people who live in the United States. But more than that, it's an intensification of the blockade, the illegal, immoral, torturous blockade that they wrote about in 1960 in the Mallory Rubottom memo, saying, inconspicuously as possible, create hardships for the Cuban people. We say, let Cuba live, let Cuba breathe, let's have normal relations between the United States and Cuba.
A todos nuestros amigos de los Estados Unidos y de las demás regiones, simplemente nos queda decir desde acá, desde el Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos, las gracias, nuestro agradecimiento por mantenerse al lado del pueblo cubano, nuestro agradecimiento por cada una de las iniciativas de solidaridad que implementan desde las diferentes regiones, y solo le podremos decir que no nos rendiremos, que acompañaremos también cada una de estas iniciativas porque sabemos que va en beneficio de nuestro pueblo y para ellos todos trabajamos.
Lamentablemente, este hecho no es la primera vez que ocurre. Integrantes de la brigada Juan Ríos Riveras sufrieron acoso tras su regreso a Puerto Rico en agosto de 2022. Hoy, Solimar Ortiz, miembro del Comité de Solidaridad con Cuba en Puerto Rico, nos comparte sus experiencias.
Saludos. Desde Puerto Rico en lucha les habla Solimar Ortiz Jusino del Comité de Solidaridad con Cuba. Durante el mes de julio de 2022, un centenar de boricuas viajamos a Cuba con la brigada Juan Ríos Rivera. Logramos el objetivo trazado por el Comité de Solidaridad con Cuba de que cada uno de nuestros integrantes tuviera la experiencia de conocer el día a día de la población cubana que se crece aún con las medidas punitivas e inhumanas del bloqueo impuestos por Estados Unidos desde hace más de 6 décadas. A nuestro regreso, continuamos con nuestro inquebrantable compromiso de la solidaridad desde nuestro suelo borincano. En el mes de agosto, a 3 semanas de nuestro regreso, agentes del FBI montaron un operativo visitando a algunos y llamando a otros de los más de 75 brigadistas y otras personas solidarias. Fue un intento de intimidar y criminalizar la solidaridad. La respuesta del comité, los brigadistas y las organizaciones solidarias no se hizo esperar. Nuestra presidenta Milagros Rivera, junto a los licenciados defensores de los derechos humanos, el licenciado Edgardo Román Espada, Alejandro Torres Rivera, Eduardo Villanueva y Francisco Santiago, todos abogados, denunciaron el acoso y la persecución por parte del FBI. De inmediato, comenzamos a recibir muestras de apoyo de todo el continente que se hizo eco de nuestras denuncias. El Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos y la Red Continental Latinoamericana y Caribeña de Solidaridad con Cuba y las Causas Justas, así como la diáspora boricua en Nueva York, jugaron un rol fundamental en la denuncia. Los compañeros del seminario El Militante, desde el día 1, estuvieron junto a nosotras y nosotros. Como brigadista y miembro activa del Comité de Solidaridad con Cuba en Puerto Rico, nos reafirmamos en que ninguna acción de intimidación detendrá nuestro compromiso. Sus acciones, en lugar de amedrentarnos, lo que hace es alentarnos a continuar con nuestra lucha por un Caribe unido y solidario. La Brigada Juan Río Rivera continuará viajando a Cuba en abierto desafío a las leyes que se nos imponen como colonia. Volvemos a Cuba, a 125 años de la invasión yanqui a Cuba y Puerto Rico, demostrando que somos una nación y que el imperio no puede bloquear la solidaridad.
Varios activistas y brigadistas nos han hecho llegar sus mensajes y hoy nuestra sección estará dedicada a compartir con ustedes sus testimonios.
Hi, my name is Sammy. I was recently on the National Network on Cuba's May Day Brigade. And when I was in Cuba, I really got to experience what it was like for solidarity to be built into a country for the very first time. And that extends from its hospitals to its gardens, to its universities. I mean, every aspect of that country, of Cuba, is really rooted in solidarity and looking out for each other. Unfortunately, when I got back to the United States, it was the complete opposite. I was immediately detained and interrogated by the US government for 2 hours, interrogating me about my job, my political beliefs, the books I had, and then eventually they threatened me with jail for not giving sufficient information. And then they also threatened me with detaining my cell phone. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but even more fortunately, this just fueled my fire to fight to end the U.S. blockade even more. Really because, the U.S. is trying to intimidate people from seeing what freedom is like and what solidarity really looks like. And, and we can't let that happen. We have to fight.
Hi, my name is Calla Walsh. I'm one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, and I was also one of the coordinators of the U.S. delegation on the International May Day Brigade, which NNOC organizes for alongside ECAP. And we had about 60 brigadistas from all different organizations across the U.S. Many of them were traveling to Cuba for the first time. And our trip was really focused on ending the criminal, illegal U.S. blockade against Cuba. And so we were there to learn about the impacts of U.S. sanctions, the impacts of the U.S. listing Cuba as a so-called state sponsor of terrorism, and also just to learn about the reality of the Cuban people beyond this propaganda that we're fed in the U.S. that Cuba is some sort of totalitarian dictatorship, which we learned couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, many of us experienced what freedom felt like as soon as we stepped foot on Cuban soil for the first time in our lives. We experienced what it's like to live in a society where workers are really in power of their government and have a say over their own futures. We experience a society that is free from class exploitation and where combating racism and sexism and homophobia are real priorities of the government, which is led by the workers. So every time I've come back to Cuba in the past year, I've seen how the effects of the U.S. blockade are really getting worse and worse, and they're aimed to strangle the Cuban people, to make the entire population suffer simply for the fact that they don't want the U.S. capitalist neoliberal economic model enforced on them. And that's why the U.S. is continuing this blockade, because the Cuban people have maintained their revolution for over 60 years, despite every U.S. attempt to overthrow it.
Hey everybody, my name is Joseph Fisher. I'm an American organizer, and I just got back from Cuba on the National Network on Cuba's May Day Brigade. And I just want to be the first to say I had an amazing time on the island. It was so inspiring as American communists to see the work and the strides that the Cuban people have made to build social structures in our lifetime to support themselves against the oppressive influence that is the American blockade. And it was just so incredible to see the lies that were fed about Cuba dissipate right in front of my eyes as I got to see the island for myself and see the amazing work that the people are doing in order to build a home and a structure of society that works for them. And one of the lies that we're consistently fed about Cuba is that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, but it was very interesting that the only state form of oppression that I faced on my trip was returning to America. As soon as Customs and Border Patrol found out I was coming back from Cuba, they immediately detained me, took me into a room with nothing on it except for white walls, and I had to sit there for multiple hours as they took turns interrogating me, leaving me in silence, searching all my possessions, and even taking away my laptop, my phone, and my tablet. I still have not seen those electronics returned to me. They say that maybe they'll give it back to me after they search and see those, but maybe they won't. So I just don't know. And it was just such an intimidating experience because that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to intimidate these Americans and to prevent them from going to Cuba and seeing the reality for ourselves. But what they don't know is that we have their support and the resilience of the Cuban people on our side, and we would not back down to these inhumane challenges. I will be returning to Cuba hopefully very soon, and I hope that I inspire many others to do as well, because we as Americans need to see this for ourselves, see the work that the Cuban people are doing, and see how much work this project has created and how much benefit has created for the Cuban people.
Hi, I'm Jada. I'm one of the 2023 May Day Brigadistas from the United States. Just traveled to Cuba. So thankful for being able to experience May Day with the National Network on Cuba, as well as our partners, ECAP inside Cuba, who work to make our schedule possible and to make this trip possible for us. We know that it's important for us to continue going to Cuba at all pressures, at all costs, by any means necessary, to show solidarity with the Cuban people, but also for us in the belly of the beast to see what they are doing directly to an island just 90 miles off the coast of us, to the people that are being affected by U.S. imperialism and the blockade directly, and getting that perspective outside of ourselves, because we know how the United States government oppresses us, but to have that perspective of being able to go somewhere and seeing the real impacts of a country that is trying to thrive and wants to do all that it can to make sure that its people has what it's need, and is doing that and could do so much more without the United States government's foot on its neck. As a result of us going to Cuba and coming back, several comrades, myself, were detained by customs and questioned for several hours. They went through our things. I know for me, they went through my things. And they do all of this to scare us and to gather as much information as possible about the things that we are doing in Cuba. And we have to keep pushing back against this. Now that we've gone through this, we know what to expect for next time, and we know how to prepare ourselves and our comrades from intimidation on behalf of the United States, and we won't stand for it. We're going to keep coming back. We're going to keep partnering with ECAP, and we're going to keep coming back to Cuba and bringing aid to Cuban people and doing what we can to make sure that the U.S. blockade ends in our lifetime.
So this year in Cuba, one of the most severe, effects of the blockade that we saw are the fuel shortages, which, of course, fuel is keeping the Cuban economy running. So because of these fuel shortages, it's harder for kids to get to school. It's harder for workers to get to their workplaces. Factories and machines and plants can't keep running. And it has really severe effects on the Cuban economy, so much that the revolutionary government made the decision to postpone the May Day parades after there were severe storms. And so we ended up selling May Day on May 5th, but again, because of the fuel shortages, we took part in celebrations in local communities rather than buses taking everyone into Havana to the big parade. And it was still an incredible May Day experience, and we really learned from the revolutionary spirit, the revolutionary resilience of the Cuban people in the face of all these obstacles caused by the blockade.
Hi, my name is Timmy Sullivan, and I was a brigadista on the 16th May Day Brigade to Cuba. One of the most inspiring things that I learned about in Cuba was the commitment to anti-imperialist struggle and how central that was to Cuban politics. Especially, I really loved meeting Palestinians who were studying medicine and surgery in Cuba to be able to take that material aid back home to Palestine and help their people who are living under military occupation. This is a model and a blueprint for what a different kind of international solidarity could look like. And I am excited to take this knowledge and this praxis back home to the United States.
I'm Joshua, Black Alliance for Peace and Malcolm X Grassroots Movement member in Philly. I was on the National Network on Cuba's May Day Brigade, and I think what struck me most about this trip was how united the Cuban people are against imperialism and how that unity sort of had like a healing and joyful factor to it. Cubans resist imperialism creatively through solidarity, through kindness, and through everyday love to one another. That was a major inspiration for me to see what it really means for people to love each other so deeply and with such intention. And it's really telling that the United States, which is so full of like bitter, individualistic cynicism, is such an enemy to a nation that's been nothing but kind and forthcoming to its citizens. They're strangling Cuba with the blockade for its desire to be sovereign, but the Cuban people don't surrender.
Y ya vamos llegando al final de nuestro programa, pero no sin antes sugerirle que se suscriba a nuestro canal de YouTube Siempre con Cuba y visite nuestro sitio web siempreconcuba.org. Siga nuestras páginas en Facebook y Twitter, allí también somos Siempre con Cuba. Por lo pronto, le digo que yo la espero aquí, como cada 17, para juntos continuar haciendo solidaridad frente al bloqueo.
Para continuar el camino, un canto de amor brotando desde los ríos. Se precisan de tus manos para chambear el egoísmo, los años de quien más sabe, las ideas de nuevo brío.
El ojo siempre alerta, el oído receptivo,
el beso tierno en la frente, el buenos días vecino.
La esquina donde siempre pueden respirar tranquilo.
Las calles brillando sueños en la risa de los niños.
Hay un pueblo de sueños y abrazos compartidos, isla que renace del esfuerzo de sus hijos. Hay una Antilla grande de azul y verde olivo. Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe.
Hay una Antilla grande de azul y verde olivo.
Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe, precisando flores frescas para continuar el camino. Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe.
Hay un campo